Hello and thank you for joining us for another episode of Grim Harvest Podcast. Special thanks goes out to our patrons, whose continued support helps make this all possible. If you become a patron, you'll have early access to every episode, as well as merchandise and content that can only be found on our Patreon account. You can find us at patreon.com/grimharvest. That's patreon.com/grimharvest.
The seeds of terror have been sown. Fire up the combine for the next Grim Harvest.
Today's episode is part 1 of Mrs. Blackmoore, a 4-part miniseries written by T.W. Grimm and produced by Steve Blizin. Starring Owen McCuen, Rhiannon McAfee, Joe Stofko, Molly Lankford, Austin Beach, Danielle Hewitt, David Collins, and Cheryl Blizin. And now, we're pleased to present Mrs. Blackmoore, Part 1. 3 Rules.
There was something very wrong with the substitute teacher. Ian knew it as soon as she opened the door to the classroom. This lady was bad news. The intruder seemed to fill up the entire doorway as she stepped into the classroom, impossibly wide and tall in a long dark skirt and matching dress jacket. Her eyes were a little too bright, and her grin was just a little too sharp. Her gaze flickered around the room with machine-like precision, scanning faces and taking in the smallest of details for future consideration. It reminded Ian of a documentary he'd seen when he was a little younger. Some hour-long PBS special about lions in the African savannah. He could imagine her tongue snaking out to lick her chops as she stared them all down, a herd of nervous antelope with nowhere to run. Instead of calling out a greeting to get their attention, the intruder cleared her throat and stomped across the room, thumping her enormous handbag down onto the teacher's desk with a resounding whump that made the entire classroom flinch in unison. She flashed a ferocious smile and wrote Mrs. Blackmoore on the blackboard in a slanting line of angry-looking block letters.
Good morning, class.
The looming figure bellowed, and she clapped her meaty palms together with a sound like thunder.
I'll ask you to stop talking and give me your full attention, please.
The classroom was instantly as silent as a tomb. The frightening woman gave the wide-eyed children a curdled grin and crooned,
Oh, that's much better. My name is Mrs. Blackmoore, and I'll be your substitute teacher for today. And tomorrow, and probably for quite some time in the foreseeable future. I'm quite pleased to meet you all, and I hope that...
Molly Rogers waved a skinny arm in the air and blurted,
What happened to Miss Wright? Why isn't she here?
Mrs. Blackmoore fixed her with a baleful stare and swooped across the room, her long skirt flapping behind her like the wings of a bat as she closed in on her prey. She leaned in close to Molly and hissed,
Molly Ann Rogers. There are 3 very important rules to follow in my classroom. Don't interrupt. Don't create a disturbance, and don't be a tattletale. We're not even one full minute into the school day, and you've already broken one of the rules.
Molly shrank down in her chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. She whispered an apology at the floor. Mrs. Blackmoore glared down at her, her left eye twitching with a barely contained fury, and she snarled,
They're always sorry when you reprimand them for misbehaving, aren't they? Mercy, yes. So sorry. Oh, you'll hear every excuse in the book when you put one of the bad ones in the hot seat.
The substitute stomped back to the chalkboard, pausing at the teacher's desk to hover close to her handbag. She started petting the lumpy old thing like a cat, and her scowl melted into a nasty little smile. The substitute whispered to her bag in a hushed tone, cooing a litany of soothing nonsense words as she scratched behind its handles. The class watched and waited in an uncomfortable silence, darting sideways glances at each other as they nervously shifted around in their desks. Ian thought the bag's tarnished zipper looked a lot like a mouth, a wide, snarling mouth, its lips wrinkled back to expose dozens of sharp little teeth. Mrs. Blackmoore gave the bag a final pat and erupted into action, her skirt swirling around in a rustling whirl of shadows as she busied herself at the front of the room. Looking at no one in particular, she said,
If you really must know, well, it appears that Miss Wright has gone missing.
The classroom stirred with some muted chatter and the rustling of restless feet. The substitute plowed on, talking over them in a tone that was brisk and vaguely sympathetic, like a newscaster reporting on some horrible disaster in a distant nation.
No one knows what happened to her, I'm afraid. She disappeared without a trace over the weekend, and now the police are involved. That's how these things go, I suppose. Some poor soul will just up and disappear one day, and they're never seen again.
Molly let out a high-pitched squeak, her face as pale as milk, and Mrs. Blackmoore shook her head in grave disappointment. She turned and began to write a series of math problems on the chalkboard.
It's not an appropriate subject to discuss in a classroom, is it, Molly?
Mrs. Blackmoore was speaking to the chalkboard, scrawling numbers and mathematical symbols with tight, swift movements of her wrist.
Why would you interrupt me with such an unpleasant topic? Why would you create such a horrid disturbance during my introduction?
Molly looked as if she was about to cry. She screwed up the last of her wilting courage and sniffled.
I didn't mean to do anything wrong. It was just a question.
Mrs. Blackmoore whirled around and pointed at the trembling girl with a nub of chalk in her fingers.
Just a question,
she repeated in an incredulous tone.
Questions can be very dangerous, Molly. Mercy, yes. Very dangerous indeed. Please stay after class has been dismissed for the day, Molly. I'd like to talk to you further about improper questions and their consequences.
But I didn't mean to.
The substitute dropped the chalk and briskly clapped her hands together again. A pistol shot, that made Ian jump a little in his seat. He banged his knees against the underside of his desk and bit down on a yelp.
Oh!
Mrs. Blackmoore roared.
I don't want to hear any excuses!
And everyone flinched in unison.
See me after class has been dismissed. Molly Rogers. Is that understood?
Tears welled up in Molly's eyes. She wiped them away with her sleeve and nodded. She looked like she was ready to faint dead away and flop into the aisle. Ian didn't blame her one bit. There was something feral lurking behind the substitute's laser precision stare. Something unpredictable and wild. It seemed impossible that they would actually hire this crazy lady to teach children. But there she was, standing at the front of the room with a decidedly off-kilter smirk on her face.
Get out your mathematics textbooks and open them to chapter 6.
Mrs. Blackmoore growled, and she slammed the teacher's copy onto the desk with enough force to rattle the windows.
You're going to work on your long division skills this morning, all of you,
she added, and her eyes once again fell on poor Molly Rogers, who was doing her very best to shrink into non-existence.
There are 3 simple rules in my classroom,
Mrs. Blackmoore said softly. She was still glaring at Molly.
I expect you to obey these rules, each and every one of them.
She lapsed into silence and let it drag on for an uncomfortably long period of time, patiently waiting to see if anyone would be foolish enough to draw attention to themselves. Finally, she drew in a deep breath and returned her attention to the blackboard.
Well, don't just sit there,
she grunted.
Start copying these problems down in your notebooks. We're gonna do this until we get it right.
After what seemed like an eternity, the final buzzer rang, and Mrs. Blackmoore dismissed her class with a curt,
Go on then, get out of here. Not you, Molly.
Ian caught up with Scotty and Mariana just outside the front entrance. On any other day, Scotty would be gleefully haranguing the other two with his manic stream of consciousness style of conversational discourse, while Mariana would be alternating between laughing at his antics and barking at him to shut his stupid shithole. But not today. Today, the trio walked together in silence. There was an unspoken elephant in their midst, and her name was Molly Rogers. It wasn't long before Scotty wordlessly pointed out the first poster, an 8x511 sheet of paper with "Missing" printed in large, bold letters across the top of the page. Centered below this was a slightly blurry photo of Miss Wright sitting in a lawn chair, smiling for the camera in a pair of cut-off denim shorts and a gray T-shirt. Ian stared at it in morbid fascination as they drew closer. According to the information below the picture, Miss Wright's first name was Lucille. She was 26 years old. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, had sandy brown hair, and she was missing. There were at least 4 posters on every block, multiple Miss Wrights taped to street lights and stapled to telephone poles, all of them smiling in the sunshine of a forgotten summer, all of them gone without a trace. Scott slowed his pace and came to a stop as the trio approached the corner, where they would split ways and head to their respective houses. He looked at the other two and said,
What, no one's gonna say it? That substitute teacher freaks me out. I'm actually scared of her. I'm not even kidding.
Mariana snorted.
No shit. That lady is intense. Is she like 7 feet tall? She takes up the whole doorway.
Mrs. Blackmoore,
Scotty intoned, and he wiggled his fingers at them in what he believed to be a spooky manner.
Did you see her petting her purse like it's a friggin' dog or something? What was that all about? She was baby talking to her own bag, dude. What the hell was that?
Ian grinned uneasily at his shoes and said,
She's a substitute, right? She won't be around for long. That bag of hers. It looked...
The image of Miss Wright sitting in a lawn chair popped into his brain, and he trailed off in mid-sentence. Denim shorts and bare feet, Miss Lucille Wright, missing at age 26. But what did that mean exactly? Missing, as in what? Just gone? Where? People don't vanish into nothingness and stop existing, so where did she go?
I just hope she leaves soon.
Ian finished, and he offered Mariana an awkward, robotic-looking shrug.
She's creepy.
Mariana raised an eyebrow and said,
You okay? You're acting weird.
Ian manufactured a weak flicker of a grin and croaked,
I'm fine. Everything's fine.
Of course he's not okay.
Scott interjected.
Do you know this kid? He's nowhere near okay.
Mariana snapped.
Could you be serious for a second? You're like dedicated to being as annoying as possible.
Scotty offered her a loud ripper of a fart in response and scrambled out of striking distance. He threw back his head and cackled,
Choke on my ass and die, Mariana! Woo!
Mariana gave him a withering look of contempt and turned back to Ian. Slowly, she said,
Well, maybe she won't be here tomorrow. I really hope not. That lady scares me.
I guess that makes 3 of us.
Ian muttered. He was thinking about the handbag. He thought about its yawning zipper mouth and the tiny brass teeth that glinted in the sterile glare of the fluorescent lighting. Scott broke the silence by letting out a rumbling belch and declaring,
That's what I think of Mrs. Blackmoore. I gotta get home. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
He turned the corner and swaggered away down the street, a short, skinny kid walking tall in red Converse shoes and a SpongeBob SquarePants baseball cap. Ian and Mariana both lingered a minute to watch him go. It felt like there was more that needed to be said out loud, much more. But Ian really didn't want to, not now. He just wanted to go home.
Miss Wright was really pretty.
Mariana said.
I never realized she was so pretty until I saw the posters. I always thought she was old or whatever, you know? She looked different at school.
Yeah, she wasn't old. 26 isn't old.
Ian could tell Mariana had a lot more to say on the subject of Mrs. Blackmoore, but he didn't want to hear it. He didn't need to anyway. He was thinking the exact same thing. He took a step back and said,
Well, I should probably get home too. Or I'll see you later.
I didn't like the way she was looking at us.
Mariana blurted.
The look in her eyes, you know? It was just weird. It made me think of a story from this old book of fairy tales I used to have when I was little. It was called Hansel and Gretel. You know the one I'm talking about. So, these kids are lost in the forest, right? They find a house made out of gingerbread and they think they're saved. But there's a witch living in the house. An evil witch. And she wants to eat them.
Ian felt the fine hair stand up on the back of his neck. He grimaced and shook his head.
No, I don't know. There's something wrong with her, though, for sure. Hey, look, I gotta get going, okay? I'll see you tomorrow.
Molly had to stay behind.
Mariana whispered. Ian pretended that he didn't catch what she had said and started to walk away. Frankly, he didn't want to catch it. All he wanted was to go home and curl up under a blanket. He would close the curtains, watch some TV, and not think about Miss Wright, Molly Rogers, or anyone else for that matter. He would curl up in a safe little hidey hole, and the morning would take care of itself. Ian chirped,
"See you later,"
over his shoulder, and picked up the pace until he was almost jogging down the street, thumbs hooked into the straps of his knapsack to keep it from bouncing around on his back. There would be no more of that kind of talk, not today. It was officially blanket time. Ian was dismally unsurprised that Molly Rogers didn't come to school the next day. Ian did his best to ignore her empty seat. Looking at it made him feel like a bird was fluttering in his chest, hammering around in a panic to fly away and escape. It was best not to think about it. Try as he might, however, Ian couldn't stop himself from staring at Mrs. Blackmoore's handbag. It stared right back at him, its brass-button eyes full of animal cunning. The more he looked at it, the more it seemed to Ian that the bag had a face. A crumpled, hateful little troll face, a patchwork golem made of shadows, stains, and creases in the ancient leather. The illusion was completed by that wide, unsettling zipper mouth. Today, it was partially unzipped, giving it a lopsided, degenerate leer. Ian didn't like it at all, not one bit. He was scared of his new teacher, but he was even more afraid of her handbag. Just before recess, Mrs. Blackmoore made a heinous discovery. Richie Gamble was chewing gum in class. This unforgivable act of rebellion was deemed disruptive behavior, and Richie was ordered to stay behind when the bell rang for recess. When recess was over, Richie was nowhere to be seen. No one asked where he went, or even brought up the fact that he was gone. No one dared to say anything at all. For the rest of the day, the classroom was as silent as a tomb. When the 3:00 bell rang, everyone drifted out like a ghost, all of them striving to remain unseen and unheard. Mrs. Blackmoore positioned herself beside the door and glared down at each student in turn, offering each of them a flashing sickle of a smile as they settled past. There was a clear warning in that smile. There were rules, and the rules were not to be broken. Not ever. Ian slung on his backpack, shoved his trembling hands into his pockets, and steeled himself to walk past the teacher's desk on his way out of the classroom. He needed to get a better look at that handbag. The handbag was even uglier up close, and it smelled awful. It reeked like a wet, moldy basement. Beneath that, there was the faintest hint of advanced decay. Ian had a nasty mental image of a pile of rotting corpses, churning with maggots and smoldering in the dark. It made his stomach roll. As Ian shuffled past the desk, he swore he could hear a faraway babble of intermingled voices, as if a radio was playing somewhere in the distance. The voices were too far away for their words to be intelligible, but it sounded like they were all screaming at the top of their lungs. Mrs. Blackmoore snapped,
"Is there something you need, dear?"
And Ian's heart lurched. His only coherent thought was, "Oh, shit, 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 shit." Ian looked up into those wide, wild eyes, and he felt the blood drain from his face. He shook his head and stammered,
"Yeah, no. What? No, nope. No, I was just, I wasn't, I was just leaving."
Ian tried to smile. He thought, Good going, dummy. You don't look guilty at all. That was totally smooth. He steeled himself to walk past her and focused on the door, casually strolling along like everything was right and fine and normal as could be. Mrs. Blackmore's sickle grin collapsed a little further into a feral snarl with every step he took. Ian attempted to slink around her, a big, terrified smile pasted on his face as he turned himself sideways to avoid physical contact. He opened his mouth to say,
"See you tomorrow."
And the substitute's hand darted in with the speed of a cobra strike, seizing him by the shoulder and stopping him dead in his tracks. It felt like he'd walked into a giant invisible blob of crazy glue. The soles of his shoes were stuck to the floor, and he couldn't move a single muscle. He couldn't even blink. Mrs. Blackmore's broad, angular features filled his line of sight, blocking out the ceiling with the black curtain of her long, frazzled mop of hair. In a breathless rush, she told him,
There are 3 rules in my classroom, Ian. Don't interrupt, don't create a disturbance, and the most important rule of them all, don't be a dirty little tattletale.
Ian struggled to speak, making a faint moaning sound in the back of his throat. Mrs. Blackmoore very slightly relaxed the grip on his shoulder, and Ian was suddenly able to utter a raspy little whisper. His voice was barely audible over the hammering of his heart.
I don't know what you're talking about.
He gasped.
I didn't say anything.
She offered a curdled grimace and crooned,
Oh, not yet. But you will. Oh, I've been in this business for a long, long time, Ian. Mercy, yes. A very long time. I know the bad ones better than they know themselves, and there's simply no question, no doubt in my mind at all, that you are a very bad boy. An awful boy. A putrid little tattletale.
I am not!
Ian squeaked.
I wouldn't do that, honest. Please, let me go.
The substitute studied his pale cheeks and bulging eyes, and Ian could see that she didn't believe him. His mind was screeching, "Run, run, 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 run!" But he couldn't lift his feet off the floor. He could barely even swallow. Mrs. Blackmoore shook her head in mock sadness.
If they ever discovered my secrets, do you know what they would do, Ian? They would hunt me. The ends of the earth, they would bind me in chains of silver, and they would burn me alive.
Her fingers clamped down hard into his flesh, and Ian fell mute once again. He could scarcely draw breath. The only movement left unchecked was the ferocious pounding of his heart.
I wouldn't do, Ian. No. No, that wouldn't do at all.
Mrs. Blackmoore raised her other hand in front of Ian's face, and she carefully traced an elaborate figure in the air with her finger. As her fingertip looped and whirled before his eyes, she chanted,
Asleep you'll be till red you see, and then you'll sleep forever.
Ian stared at the empty air where she'd traced the rune and wheezed out a soft groan. He could see the shape twisting and twirling hypnotically in his mind's eye, a complicated series of lines and swirls that glowed red with potent secrets. The rest of the world fell away in strips and shards, and all that remained was the rune, whispering its irresistible demands in a tongue he couldn't quite understand.
Go on.
Mrs. Blackmoore crooned, and she released her death grip on his shoulder. Ian was abruptly free of the invisible force that was holding him in place, and he stumbled away on rubbery legs, taking big, shambling strides out the door and all the way down the hall to the front entrance. Scott and Mariana were waiting for him outside, but Ian pushed right past them and kept striding along, his eyes rendered blind and his ears struck deaf to all sounds save for the whispering of the rune. The people around him were nothing but vague shadows and inaudible background noise, dull flickers of motion in a world made of layers of nothing. It was all distant and completely unimportant to his mission. He couldn't stop moving his legs, nor did he want to. His legs walked him across the schoolyard, putting one foot in front of the other, all on their own, and there was nothing he could do but come along for the ride. He heard Scott yell,
"Ian! Hey, Dickface!"
But it didn't matter. Scotty was unimportant. His words were the faint buzzing of a housefly in a distant corner of the room, easily ignored. "Just a few more steps and I'll sleep forever," Ian thought, and tears started rolling down his cheeks. Won't that be nice? From somewhere far, far away, Mariana shrieked,
Ian! Stop!
but there would be no stopping. Not until he saw red. A big, beautiful wave of red would come crashing over him, and then he would sleep. Mercy, yes. 4 more steps, 3 more, 2 more. And now he would sleep. His eyes would be closed, and he would sleep forever. Scott thundered,
"Ian!"
directly behind him, and he was abruptly hauled off his feet by a mighty tug on his knapsack. He fell hard onto the sidewalk. And a split second later, a lifted Ford pickup truck screamed past at 30 miles over the speed limit, the driver laying on the horn as the brakes locked up with a tortured squeak of rubber on pavement. The truck fishtailed wildly and scraped against the curb, leaving a long black scuff across the cement as it shuddered to a halt. Ian stared at the truck in a daze. One more step, just one, and he would have been reduced to a grisly smear on the road. He took in a shuddering breath and croaked,
"Holy crap! Holy fucking shit!"
Mariana was suddenly standing over him, her face frozen in a shocked expression that matched her own almost perfectly. She slapped him weakly on the shoulder and croaked,
Are you serious right now? You almost died, dumbass! What the hell?
Beside him, Scotty reached over and slapped his other shoulder, this time hard enough to sting, and he hissed,
"What the fuck, Ian? What's wrong with you?"
Ian could only look back and forth between them and shake his head. He felt sick to his stomach. If Scotty had reached for him just a bare millisecond later, there would have been nothing to grab. Ian would have been gone. A young man in jeans and a plaid shirt jumped out of the pickup and wailed,
"Is he dead? Oh my God, is he dead?"
A swarm of parents quickly surrounded the driver in a boiling cloud of righteous fury. He warded them off with outstretched arms and shouted,
"I don't know what the hell happened. Get away from me!"
A portly woman in a pink tracksuit detached herself from the milling ranks of the lynch mob and stormed over to check on Ian. She knelt down and shook a finger at him, her face a puffy slice of orange-tinted bread dough in oversized sunglasses.
"I thought you were dead."
She screeched at him.
"If your friend here didn't grab you, oh my goodness, you would have been killed. Why weren't you paying attention?"
Ian barely even registered what she was saying. He was staring at the fan of papers the woman was holding in her other hand. Her shrill nasal whine faded to a faint drone as he blinked at them, a thick wad of 8.5 by 11 sheets with "missing" printed across the top of every sheet in large, bold letters. Miss Wright would soon have company. Molly Rogers was now starring in her very own poster. She was 5 feet tall, weighed 85 pounds, and she was missing. The woman reached to seize Ian by the arm, and he surged to his feet, knocking her over and scattering her posters to the wind in the process. Ian ignored her high-pitched squawking and started to run. He ran all the way home and collapsed on his front porch with a burning stitch in his side. He lay there for a long time, panting for air and mewling from the pain of the cramp in his side.
Until Red, you see.
He wheezed out loud. And he'd seen Red, hadn't he? Mercy, yes. The pickup truck was painted a deep, glossy red as freshly spilled blood. Despite the greasy sweat that was rolling down his face and soaking his clothes to the skin, Ian broke out in goosebumps. Mrs. Blackmoore's attempt to make his death look like an accident had failed. She would be coming for him. But what was he supposed to do? The substitute was a lioness clothed in rustling shadows, an elemental force that chinked along in square-toed leather boots. She had tried to make his death look like an accident, and nearly succeeded. But next time, she wouldn't bother. Ian would simply cease to exist, just like the rest of them, and his picture would appear on a stack of posters the very next day. He was a loose thread, and it was certain that Mrs. Blackmoore wouldn't tolerate a loose thread. When a monster hides in plain sight, camouflage is everything. Her existence depended on the skepticism of rational minds. It depended on no questions being asked and no suspicions being allowed to take root in the stony soil of an adult's barren imagination. Her existence depended on her 3 rules, and rule number 3 was the most important of them all. There was only one thing he could do, and that was to break her precious rule. He had to tattle on her as loud as he could and hope for the best. The front door opened, and Ian's mother poked her head out to stare at him with a puzzled expression. She asked,
"Why are you lying down on the porch? Come on, get inside and get washed up. Supper's going to be early tonight."
The door swung closed again before he could answer. Ian hugged his knees to his chest and murmured to himself,
She already knows I'm still alive. She's gonna come after me.
As he said the words out loud, it dawned on Ian that Mrs. Blackmoore had somehow known every student's name on the first day, every single kid in the class. She'd never taken so much as a quick peek at the attendance list, not once, but she'd still known every kid's name. How? Ian already knew the answer to that question. Her handbag had told her. It was alive, horribly and impossibly alive. From inside the house, Ian's mother bellowed,
"Get in here and wash up. Supper's ready."
Ian hauled himself to his feet and opened the door with stiff, clumsy fingers. He's never been less hungry for dinner in his whole life. He didn't know how he was supposed to convince his parents that Mrs. Blackmoore was a witch, but he had to figure it out right quickly, because he only had one shot at making them believe his story. After that, his pleading would fall on deaf ears. And then, I'll sleep forever, Ian thought, and he blinked away the tears that threatened to start pouring down his face. He took in a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whoever might be listening, and stepped inside to face whatever might happen next.
Follow us, if you dare, for stories, exclusives, merchandise, and more at grimharvestpodcast.com. All stories heard on this podcast are produced under license. No portion of this content can be rebroadcast or distributed without the express prior written consent from the story's author. To obtain license and permissions necessary to rebroadcast or distribute a specific story, please contact us at admin@grimharvestpodcast.com. This is a Black Crow Audio production.